find it really, really difficult to find anything, which is partly why the political debate in this country is about, differences of sort of 1 or 2% overall in total spending, which is, huge amounts of heat and light, often more heat than light, about a very small chunk of spending. Because actually most of the people doing that debating don't really know very much about the details of the huge amount of government spending. And that's not a criticism of them, it's just the reality is government and the public sector is so enormous that a relatively small number of ministers and their shadows and other interested MPs in Parliament are never going to know that much about that whole behemoth. And so now there is this extra incentive that, given lots of savings have to be found, that exposing stuff, making it easier for you to run the story about the embarrassing £5 million that's being wasted, actually is a good thing, because that's then £5 million that can be saved from next year's budget.
I suppose it also relates to when the thousands of job cuts story when the public sector shrinks, so maybe journalists have got it both ways, really.
Yes,
they've got good photo, because ultimately this is something that results in job cuts in the public sector, and maybe we don't have enough empathy for public sector administrators or something here, but we're eulogising something that actually will result in people losing their jobs. So there's a balance here, isn't there? I think I'm quite interested to know, Stuart, how you would, what's the balance in reporting here, a great openness that ultimately results in potentially a lack of empathy for a new government as more and more people become unemployed?
I mean, I think the bottom line is everyone is braced for enormous public sector cuts anyway, and I think most of us regard greater openness as worth that. I mean, the fact is these cuts are coming anyway. Greater openness will just help target them better. I mean, I think there's also something in public mood about openness that we need to bear in mind on the back of the MP's expenses scandals, which is through seeing the redacted versions of the expenses. We suddenly had an idea of, it entered the public consciousness that there was a difference between what those in power said was the truth and what's the full truth. And that's, any kind of FOI legislation, any kind of openness is going to have to jump across that.
Yep, just to draw one comparison with equalities legislation, that has in some ways been driven further by the courts. So I wonder if there is resistance to FOI, if in fact there might be some legal actions and court decisions that do drive openness. That's just a thought.
I mean, my background is originally as a journalist, but I've been dealing with trying not to get dealing too much with government because I'm on a local public data panel. But my experience is that whilst there are people like Andrew's fantastic in central government, I've been amazed at how there have been some senior civil servants really pushing for this to happen. But I don't think the process has changed at all. I don't think there's a move among the civil service as a whole towards open data. I think there's going to be enormous resistance in the middle ranks. I think they're absolutely obsessed with process because it allows them deniability. It means it's not their fault. I think the late was obsessed with putting stuff out to tender, which was a huge mistake. I think there's an enormous amount that needs to be done. At the moment, there are a lot of incentives to do big, slow projects that the failure only becomes apparent many years after the fact. And actually, it's not going to be on the official books anyhow. And I'm slightly concerned that the Conservatives in particular were talking about a lot more outsourcing. And outsourcing generally, over the last 5-10 years, has been a failure. And the fact that I don't think the right to data or Freedom of Data Act or whatever they have will mean a great deal unless we have it applied across the board to any data that is government data, whether it's being processed, managed or anything like. In fact, I would go as far as to say that if we don't have that, there will be an incentive for organisations, for public bodies, central and local, to put things out to outsource things because it will allow that data and those FOI requests not to be made public.
Yeah, obviously the whole open data thing is great because it gets, helps accountability and all that. But is that, with the Conservatives' big plan for the big society where you can take over your local school and other local services, is the whole open data movement not undermined by that? Because then actually local services that need to be, a lot of the time journalists actually are there to hold accountable. Does it make it difficult for them to do that and for the public to actually hold local services to account, because actually it's not controlled by the local authorities anymore, because they've been pushed out to other maybe private organisations or public organisations that under the big society have taken over?
So you might, the efficiencies you might have gained from having some of this stuff at a central big organisation soon seep away when you start to unpick that. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm thinking more that as services get pushed out from local authority control under the big society, that actually it's going to be harder to hold those people to account. Right. And so even though open data is, the movement is here, which is great, actually it's not going to affect local services on the ground.
One behind you.
I think just to connect some of, Anne's question, Chris's point, it's about accountability, and under pt5 and any number of other initiatives, the Birmingham Council case, what you have is public bodies which are becoming more accountable and privately owned bodies which are no more accountable. And as you contract out more and more public services, unless you can bring in FOI and open data requirements and apply it to those privately owned organisations, we haven't actually won that much. It's good, but I'm quite wary about this notion that there's some kind of trade-off between open data and cuts in services. As if you can have open data, but you have to build your own hospitals. And this is not a good trade-off. It's not a good way of conceptualising it either. We could have open data, and we could use that to improve public services.
Let's deal with a bigger issue there. So it's society really about shifting accountability from a coalition government down to the rest of us. So effectively, during the 5-year compulsory term, we won't be able to push any blame to them because we'll have a whole host of micro-organisations that we can blame more directly locally. I can see I'm looking at you.
I think there's a matter of detail and a broader matter of principle. I think the matter of detail is about where the boundaries are drawn for the rights to data and the publishing of details of contracts. And I think, in a sense, you're absolutely right that the risk is if those boundaries are drawn too narrowly, they end up being not as major step forwards as they should be. And I think, it's quite promising in the sense that the other part of the package is talking about expanding the scope of freedom of information. So I think the general direction, partly in terms of what people in the previous Labour government have done, and partly, actually, particularly, I'll say, and actually I think people from the Conservative rather than the Liberal Democrat side of the coalition, is about broadening the reach of those powers. So I think that's hopefully, quite promising on the detail. On the broader principle about accountability, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. Let me give you an example. The Office of the Public Guardian. I don't know, has anyone heard of the Office of the Public Guardian? Yes, probably. Yeah, probably because you've read my blog post about the Office of the Public Guardian. The Office of the Public Guardian is this